Hello, Matt.
Hey, Jesse, how was that election clusterfuck for you?
It really threw everything off kilter for a while there, huh? Lost a
Right?
whole week. Lost a whole week to the black hole.
I felt like everybody's in a diaper watching TV with the internet IV in their arms or buttocks.
Like in Idiocracy.
Yeah, exactly. I was just like totally crazy and interesting and topical given our subject matter for today.
America, yet again, proving itself as the greatest democracy the world has ever known. How about it? Number one.
Never known.
We're going to talk about Astra Taylor's most recent works, the book and film, but we'll leave a link to a nice recording of a discussion that she had with David Graeber in 2019 upon the release of the book. And there was something he said in their chat that was, I think, relevant, that Americans have absolutely no conception how to do democracy.
He said, but they can do communism.
Right. Everyday communism every day, but when it comes to deliberation and decision making together, boy, oh boy, I have no clue how to do it.
Perfect example of this is my friend who has an HOA, those housing agreements with this condo she lives in. And she was talking about an issue with the swimming pool and COVID, and they just didn't want to debate her because they didn't know how to actually debate her. They just said, well, this is
They don't know how to
our
deliberate.
decision. Yeah, there's no deliberation. Because she was saying, look, I want to see what your ideas are and tell me what you think, and we'll maybe come to an agreement what's the best idea by going back and forth and deliberating. And like, we don't do deliberation. Like, well, what does that mean? What are you talking about? So yeah, we have no absolute conception of democracy because we don't do it in our daily life.
Yeah.
There's no features of deliberation. We've lost union halls and we have no meetings about where we actually have a say.
Coming to this realization in the echoes of Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012, and the demands for more democracy in the street and in the squares, and involvement in that is presumably what prompted these two companion projects. First, the film, Astra Taylor, What is Democracy?, which was released in 2018. And then shortly after was a companion book called Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone, released by Metropolitan Books in 2019. Astra Taylor previously made the films Zizek, released in 2005, following the philosopher Slavoj Zizek, and then a film called Examined Life in 2008. And a previous book in 2015 was called The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. And she is a co-founder of the Debt Collective, which we talked about, episode 36, and wrote the foreword to that book, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition. Astra Taylor is what Naomi Klein calls a rare public intellectual, utterly committed to asking humanity's most profound questions, yet entirely devoid of pretensions.
And that would be a good description of her writing style for this book. And I've taught and used the People's Platform largely because she was involved with Occupy. And I was like, oh, this is great. It's a writer that's coming out of Occupy Wall Street. And I would like to hear her voice on the internet. And, the People's Platforms, I think, was ahead of its time in 2015 because it was the first one to really actively poke holes in and have an anti-capitalist perspective on Silicon Valley when it was still very much in the headspace of like, there are prophets and they'll save us, where it was really starting to poke holes in that. Once again, a very nice style, somewhere between David Graeber and Rebecca Solnit's style of writing, very polished and lithe as well, supple at the same time. And she doesn't have wasted space in her books. You can read nonfiction, you feel like, you could have cut this. And I don't ever feel like I ever had that feeling in either book.
Every paragraph is essential. Just to give an overview of these companion pieces, first we'll talk about the film, What is Democracy? What are your thoughts on the film, Matt?
I thought it was beautiful. I think it was my favorite documentary that I had seen in 2018 and was incredibly moving, I think, in a weird way, which I wasn't expecting to be moved by a documentary that typically would feature talking heads. But the emotional testimony aspects of the way she interviews people is really immediate and intimate and feels naked. And, my students had seen it with me as well, and they just felt very energized to talk about democracy in a committed way. And they felt like they had a language to talk about it when they didn't initially.
Good. I see the film as a meditation on the question, what is democracy? what does the word actually mean? So unlike other documentary films, it's not a treatise or a declaration or a manifesto. It's not an argument for some theory of democracy. It is a seemingly humble and honest quest to collect wisdom about the idea of democracy. And in this film, she visits some high-profile public intellectuals that she knows, but also everyday folks on the street.
And unexpected things like middle school kids talking about cafeteria lunches, Black kids in Florida that are bereft of any educational opportunity to live in a kind of prison zone. And that's the most moving section of the film. I mean, I think I actually teared up when I watched the girl talk about her lack of freedom. And I'm like, wow, damn, her intensity of thought rivaled Cornel West or Wendy Brown. And I love the fact that she was willing to get that out of people. Both her approach as in a very non-authoritarian way, saying like, I'm going to talk to everybody as if they're a philosopher, which is kind of what you do as an anarchist, is treat everyone as if they have the potential to know something. And that's like something Jeremy Corbyn often said, is like, everyone you meet knows something you don't know. And that's the attitude I think she took with her interviews with people, on sidewalks or at beaches or in, high schools with lack of funding and those sorts of things. So she calls it, and it's really true, she does kind of the philosophical documentary. I don't know if you felt that way from seeing the other films, that they feel like they're about philosophy.
Absolutely. All three of her films are meditations on
But an
philosophy.
Occupy Wall Street version of philosophy, like as if we had a door that was always open.
The phrase that she uses, I've heard her use, is that she is practicing the politics of listening. And to me, what she does as a whole in her practice, in the writing and in the filmmaking and everything else, is akin to curating. She is a wisdom curator. She's curating wisdom and putting it together in these very moving ways.
Which is fascinating, because if you listen to her in any interviews, she has a very caffeinated personality, speaks very fast like I do. And she turns into this kind of mesmeric person with a very graceful voice. When she interviews people in the documentary, says, oh, wow, she's like very methodical and quiet, doesn't take up much space. And then when you hear her talk with others, she's very caffeinated, energized, Gen Xer. And so you get...
That's how we feel. It's like,
exactly.
Jesus fucking Christ, what's wrong with every fucking thing?
Fucking tree work.
Why is everything so backwards?
And maybe that's a particular type of Gen Xer in some sense. I don't know.
I think it's the ones who actually listen to the lyrics of Rage Against the Machine. I think what she does in the films and what she does in this film is an earnest engagement with a fundamental question. And in all the work is taking up seemingly simple questions, but that are profound. This film is building upon the previous two films by posing simple but urgent philosophical questions in a composed and patient manner, and allowing her subjects, who admittedly many of them are famous public intellectuals, but allowing all of her subjects to think out loud in front of the camera. So you get moments like when you said that was moving with the school children, and the one student who had an insightful moment there and her peers all cheered her.
It's a kind of amazing child speech of profound wisdom. And I think the documentary feels like the Agora, where everyone is given an equal gaze. And it's not that she's not editing things. She's looking for the most fantastic moments of all of her interviews with people. But the fact that she still had this multiplicity of voices from different educational backgrounds, and the fact that the most mesmeric moment comes from a non-celebrity is important.
And I would just have to say that I have a great affinity for the practice and for the body of work and for the films, especially because for me, I largely see the practice as approaching. And the previous film, Examine Life, was much more straight on this kind of thing because it used this approach in a literal way, going on walks with philosophers. But I see the body of work engaging in the philosopher's walk. For me, that's important just because for my life since a teenager, this kind of contemplative space of quiet reflection that you can reach in the walk and the insights that you can unfurl in your mind from that practice of the philosopher's walk has been important to me, and it's been valuable in keeping me sane. And it's also, I think it's important because it connects to a lot of things we always talk about. It connects to argument for why the cities need to be walkable and why every neighborhood should be a university. I made the argument before, and we'll talk about more, I hope, in the future, and why the pace of society needs to slow down. because really the more we can build spaces in our environment so that we can all engage in philosophers' walks, as it were, it'll help make us better at democracy.
So do you think this philosopher's walk, which seems to be a good metaphor and way of approaching the book, do you think the documentary is structured differently than the book in some ways? So if you were to organize it in terms of structure, did you find there was a difference between the film's structure and the book?
I find that all of the work takes up that kind of pace, that 3 mile per hour pace of thinking. The careful, meditative pace is shared between the film and the book. But because they are different mediums, they require different organizing structure. And so they take different patterns. So the film is broken up into essentially 4 reels with an intro and a conclusion. And it starts out presenting the problem that democracy is in trouble, that it is supposed to be power of the people, but it's something that's never actualized. It's always something struggled for. The first reel of the film talks about those who would seek to rule. So it launches into the sequence with this young person saying that what inspires them is not democracy, but the phrase the American dream and the ability to climb. And that juxtaposed against some sound bites from Donald Trump to illustrate the...
Yeah, and Trump is certainly, he was rags to riches story, I'm left to assume.
Failing upward.
It's almost the appeal of myths over the actual person speaking it.
Yeah. This section of the film, Cornel West and Wendy Brown offer some wisdom in reflecting on this part of the problem. Cornel West calling upon Plato and mentioning how we're still wrestling with Plato's challenge, and Wendy Brown talking about how democracy has been appropriated and
to do awful things.
Yeah, that all kinds of things are done in the name of democracy that we would presumably object to. The second section of the film talks about economics and debt and spends time in Greece, talking about the Greek so-called bailout referendum and all of that. The third section talks about inequality, and this is a section wherein, first time I watched the film, this was the most important part because it was like the part where they mentioned sortition, talking about the reflection on the Athenian tradition of election by lot for legislatures.
Which is important for me too, because both the documentary gave us more details about sortition that I didn't know before watching the documentary, and then also the book goes even to more detail, really much more richly observed detail. But I was at Occupy Riverside when I first was suggested the idea of sortition. I had never heard of such an idea. It's great to see her have that in there. And so it's not surprising that she goes from the Greek bailouts and the lack of democracy in the current electoral system, and then moving into this kind of thing where, well, we could just run the show ourselves.
Back to an original idea from democracy.
The future is a mixtape.
Yeah. And then the final reel or the final section of the film talks about who are the people in this so-called democracy, who is the we in this democracy.
Yeah, Wendy Brown frames that in a very terrifying way. What is the we? Because to have a democracy, there has to be an inside-outside group. Now, we can agree or disagree with this, and I actually disagree with this in some ways, and I can provide more of a filter on that later in, but the we's should be constituted by rates of participation rather than geographic zones.
So that's the film part of these sister projects.
And especially with the conclusion, I love the conclusion when Cornel West says, like, I'm going to take on Plato's challenge. I may be a fool, but I'm willing to believe that we could have a real democracy.
Yeah, we'll circle back to that later. So in wrapping up the production of the film, she began to write the book. Democracy may not exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. What are your thoughts generally on the book?
I think this is the most polished and beautiful book we've read for a podcast, and one of the finest works of nonfiction I've read in quite some time.
We've been reading a lot for the podcast and discussing books like the Debt Collective Manifesto that are shorter, argument-driven kind of texts. But this book is a little lengthier. It's a large collection of extremely astute and insightful observations on history, political theory, sociology, and philosophy. The book, like the films, has a calm and measured pace. It never rushes to make a point. Rather, it offers a collection of observations. It's carefully arranges them in an easy, connecting rhythm, which cumulatively illustrate a point. It's more like, let me line these things up for you, and you can see for yourself.
Yeah, it really feels like a DJ. Or I would say she's like a DJ like Quentin Tarantino, but she's really much more like a curator, where you're really walking through a gallery and transposing through images. And so I think that's an aspect of the kinds of work that she's doing in this project.
There's other things that we've read that you've referred to as sort of works of collage, and I see her practice relating to collage as a collage kind of practice. And I would say that Astra Taylor's strategy seems to be one of don't take my word for it.
Yeah.
Here's what all these other folks have said about it. This is an admirable strategy because it's one that contextualizes the author's point of view within an ecosystem of ideas rather than as the culmination of some professional practice.
Oh, and incredibly unique because I can't think of a documentary that was written out alongside a book. So it's very interdisciplinary. And that makes sense why she's able to draw from sociology, anthropology, political science.
Yeah.
And the people she uses are very smart and intelligent, but they're coming from traditional and non-traditional forms of education.
Yeah, it's the kind of work that takes the approach of the author as participant as opposed to the author as authority. And I think this is a much more socialist kind of strategy. But also what I'd say is that the book and the film are meditations. They're not battle cries, but they're fuel for the fight.
Yeah.
But also recognize that in her work as a part of a collective, the Debt Collective, that manifesto is a battle cry.
It is an attack plan.
Together,
it is an attack plan. Yeah.
This is like we're feeding up on the wisdom we need for the fight in these works. But that other book, the Debt Collective book, is the battle cry for the fight.
And you could actually see how the Debt Collective, which she co-wrote and did the forward for, is actually like a sequel to this book because she focuses on debt at the back end of this.
Many of the things that she talks about throughout the book find their way into the Debt Collective manifesto.
Like the Haitian Revolution. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I wanted to do in this conversation was to take up the structure that's used in the book. So the book is 8 chapters with an introduction and a conclusion, bookending them, but 8 chapters that are each a meditation on a paradox or a tension about democracy.
Or a binary, right?
Or a binary. So the book, as she says in the introduction, is an invitation to think about the word democracy from various angles and is her call to democratize society from the bottom up. Here, democratize society, democratize everything.
Crucial in this, and you can see the through line really comes from her interview with Cornel West, where Cornel West talks about living in the tension, right? Living between the tightrope, right? And so the chapters are living between the tightropes of these binaries.
Each chapter does some version of tracing the concept of democracy from ancient Athens to present day and stopping off at historical turning points throughout. So instead of trying to retell each of those, what I'm hoping we could do is just take up each of them briefly, these tensions, and offer some additional thoughts or observations about each of these tensions about democracy. But to set us in there, I just wanted to read one passage from the introduction that lays out the structure of the project. As we shall see, for democracy to continue and transform, the 2 poles represented by the paradoxes explored in these pages must be held in thoughtful, delicate tension. Tension, that's the key word. Consider democracy's dark history, from slavery and colonialism to facilitating the emergence of fascism, from the omnipresent threat of nuclear annihilation to the danger posed by climate change. Think of all the bad decisions made by democratic humanity. The disastrous referendums, the selfish attachment to bigoted beliefs, stubborn refusal to evolve even when our lives depended on it. All this makes democracy a leap of faith, as philosopher Cornel West calls it, one that requires a living in the tension of paradoxes unresolved and arguably irresolvable. The history of democracy is one of oppression, exploitation, demagoguery, dispossession, domination, horror, and abuse, but is also a history of cooperation, solidarity, deliberation, emancipation, justice, and empathy. Which side do we fall on? Where should the emphasis land? In the final hour, is democracy a lost cause or our last hope?
A great passage. And that's an example of living in the tension.
And sets up the logic for the structure of the book and therefore these 8 tensions. So the first one is freedom and equality. In this first chapter, she talks about how those at the top of our hierarchical societies have long pushed the bad idea that equality inhibits freedom, whereas those most disparaged and dispossessed have shown over and over that freedom and equality are, in fact, complementary.
Yeah. And she's saying this is a tension that doesn't have to exist. I mean, this is the tension where she's, I think, the most critical of. She says that, well, we don't have to have inequality to have democracy. This is the thing that I think she shoves off against the most. And I agree with her. It's totally absurd. And it's a project of order liberals and the neoliberal project Mont Pelerin Society that somehow we must have inequality to have democracy and freedom. And she quotes William F. Buckley Jr. as an example of that democracy breeds inequality, which is totally offensive and insane. Yeah. But it tells you how baked in it is by the right to somehow think that we have to have inequality to have democracy.
That is somehow a trade-off, that you can't have both.
Yeah.
You
can't have your cake and eat it too, right? Well, I'm going to shove the cake in my mouth and eat you.
I would say that there can be no freedom without equality. Yeah. And that we have to stop thinking of freedom as freedom to run the race. That's mostly how it's framed, is that you're all free to compete.
And it tells you this project is much larger than we suspect, because if you look at the civil rights movement, there's a freedom phase and there was an equality phase. Now, obviously, I think they're linked, but there's the idea of civil participation and voting rights versus actual economic power and economic rights. And the second phase of the civil rights movement is the one that's ignored. In media consumption, popular conception, and the general dominance is that idea of that the highest achievement for blacks is to actually go to the same school that has shitty funding or be able to vote without poll taxes or the threat of violence and lynching. And we forget about the freedom budget. We forget about the horizon that MLK talked about, which is, what's the point of having a place at the counter for the lunch if we can't afford the hamburger? And that part's ignored for a reason, because they don't want that world.
Our conception of freedom must not be contingent on someone else's sacrifice or oppression or invisibility. And this is the logic of hierarchies, whether it is the neoliberal project or the rule of kings or capitalism. It is always about we have to trade one for the other. You can't have both, which is entirely false. And recall, too, the urgent observation from the Combahee River Collective that until Black women are free, none of us will be free. Mm-hmm. It connects here, too, to conversations about the Golden Square, the provision fully decommodified of food, shelter, healthcare, and education, the material needs to live a dignified life. Those are the bare minimum for freedom, which would define as having the means of being able to choose what to do with one's life, as opposed to this freedom from interference kind of definition, this freedom to compete kind of definition, the freedom to oppress others definition that is the world we live in.
It's juxtaposed against the different types of freedoms, which FDR's four freedoms she referenced has been reconceived in the neoliberal era, and also on page 41. The European Union officially champions a transnational economic vision founded on what we have come to know as the other four freedoms, although these four freedoms are of goods, freedom of capital, freedom of services, and freedom of fucking labor. Right to work bullshit. And so the Golden Square is now this Golden Square of consumer and capital rights.
We need freedom for human beings, not freedom for capital.
The war in our future, as the wars are past, is human freedom over the freedom of property.
The next tension, the next paradox is
binary.
The next binary is conflict and consensus. In this chapter, she says that the pursuit of consensus is an enduring ideal that has been consistently thwarted by conflicts in society in religious, racial, gender, and material relations. So what are your thoughts on conflict and consensus, holding this tension?
This is the one where I felt like had some little holes in it, that it's a little too critical of consensus. And she does say, hey, it does exist, like exists in the United Nations, it exists in other places, and it doesn't have to be in the streets. But she doesn't mention Rojava, which uses a system of democratic confederalism or municipal communalism from Murray Bookchin. And you can achieve consensus if you have a shared value and a future. And she tends to be a little too negative on consensus, I felt. That was like my problem. She felt like this is a Quaker conspiracy theory and we can't ever completely give into consensus. We have to maybe acknowledge the importance of it, but that it actually can't work. And this is probably where David Graeber would disagree with her in the book.
I think she mentions Graeber in this chapter. She mentions David Graeber and his work throughout the book.
And she mentions it in her obituary, and then I think the New York Times review of books, where she says, like, Graeber was very idealistic about direct democracy. I don't necessarily share his enthusiasm of what that could mean as possible. So she's a skeptic. She says, I have anarchist friends, idealistic anarchists, always an intensifier on top of something that seems delusional. Yeah. But that's the chapter where I had the most disagreement. I think you can have a system of consensus. That's called people's assemblies. That's called participatory democracy. That means direct democracy. And it's not to say that we can't have representation, but that representation can come from a system of consensus.
As a so-called idealist anarchist, I would say that democracy as an idea must exist in conflict and in contrast to hierarchy. That systems of hierarchy, like capitalism, are antagonistic to democracy and in conflict with democracy. So in terms of conflict being part of democracy, I think insofar as we have democratic practices in society, they are in conflict with systems of hierarchy.
And this is where if I could have deliberated as an editor, I said, how about consensus versus hierarchy?
Right.
That's a better tension, right?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's as poetic, but it
doesn't have the CC interaction of alliteration, conflict and consensus. Yeah.
But, again, I agree that democracy is an ideal, but as an ideal, it is itself in conflict with other ideas about how the world should be organized and how the world should be designed. So democracy is kind of by nature an idea set in motion in the world in conflict with other histories unfolding.
She talks about that in her conversation about a book with David Graeber, and also in here, like the title is called Shouting as One, which is like, when you say democracy, what does it actually really mean? Because when I'm saying this is what democracy looks like, it's like, well, 10 of my friends are out in the street with me.
In my view, democracy has to be anti-capitalist, has to be anti-racist, has to be anti-misogynist, has to be anti-imperialist. And as we would conceive democracy as an ideal that we may not ever achieve, we should likewise think of consensus as an ideal, as part of the practice of democracy that we may never achieve in a pure way.
Yeah, she should have said consensus is the ideal.
Yeah.
And we may not achieve it in all manners, but it's something that should be at the root of our respect for each other.
Yeah.
If you're not going to try to search for consensus, you're not actually interested in democracy.
Yeah.
It should be a default setting for any attempt at deliberation of democracy is the attempt to achieve consensus. And it's this idea of equality.
It's a horizon line that we continually aim for. It gives us the thing to always be striving for. So I would say that consensus is not just an ideal of cooperative determination, but how we determine what is true. Consensus is a tool of science. So if you think about peer review and how hypotheses in science are always open to continual testing and challenge, consensus is always an ideal in science.
Yeah.
But I think where it gets clouded is that when it comes to matters of preference and or those things that are continually and unfortunately in culture reframed or miscast as matters of belief or merely matters of belief or preference, consensus can then lead us astray, right? Because if we have consensus around bad ideas. Again, this is reflected in that passage from the introduction. The history of democracy is full of these bad referendums, Brexit and voting for racist tyrants and that kind of thing. Consensus, if we're attached to bad ideas, that can lead us astray. Ideas like that the earth is flat or that markets will solve everything. But I would argue that we need consensus around human dignity and the public good. Need consensus that Black trans lives matter.
And we need consensus around the golden square, right? Which is, we're not going to go anywhere in terms of survivability without a consensus on the golden square, which I think is achievable and already there.
How I would frame things in the most urgent way is that we need consensus that climate change is caused by humans and it is real and we have to deal with it. So we need consensus around climate change and we need consensus around the golden square. And the providing of human dignity, the material means for freedom to every single person on the planet.
And this being said, I feel like, okay, this chapter is really the section that dwells the most on Occupy. This is the Occupy Wall Street chapter and her conflicted and ambivalent feelings, which she definitely makes it sound like it was a net positive, but she definitely is concerned about this theology of consensus, that obsessional gaze toward it is the root of all downfalls and that it moves in the opposite direction of where we want to aim for. And I do share her ambivalence about Occupy Wall Street because I was involved with Occupy Riverside, but there was was a lot of things about the society as a whole that made it difficult to do because people doing care work like nurses or hospice care workers or teachers, they couldn't make it. People with kids couldn't make it. So it was the system around Occupy, which is why Occupy couldn't work. It wasn't that Occupy as the consensus model couldn't work. It's that not everybody could go to every meeting and be at every event. So it already had a limit on it because of these scarcity aspects of our society.
And the practices and processes of deliberation of actually doing democracy. Democracy as a verb is something that is so foreign to us. So we can't say that, well, we tried it for a couple of weeks at a square where just a handful of people could participate and it didn't go that well, so we can't do it anymore. No, it is something that we need to continually practice in every area, every sphere of society. And it is something that we will get better at with practice.
Yes. And she mentions this, how people had just forgot how to do democracy in consensus because we don't experience it in our workplace.
It reminds me of one thing in that conversation with David Graeber that caught my attention because it was just said quickly and in passing, but I think was a really insightful comment by David Graeber, was that there can be pleasure in changing your mind.
Yes, I love that part.
Through
I love
deliberation, you can actually find joy or pleasure in changing your mind. I entirely agree. I think it's hard, but it is possible.
Especially if it's a better idea, it's more exciting. And something about creativity and you're building off each other and they have a better, more creative idea. It's actually exciting, especially when it's about art or art making. And I think maybe the reason why we don't find pleasure, or people that don't find pleasure in changing their mind, is because of the scarcity landscape of this capitalist hellscape. And also because we are so unloved in general. And then if we had an affirmation of belonging in our lives in a meaningful way, we'd be more willing to say we're wrong.
Our only options are just to like put our 2 cents wherever we can find space for it, and hopefully it'll get attention. All we are always doing is competing for attention, and that in no way is reflective of democratic processes.
Twitter pating on Twitter for love, and the ways in which we'll just talk about the most private things to get likes on social media, right? And it says a lot about the fact that we no longer think we can get those things from our community. And so it makes it more difficult to actually change our mind.
But deliberation is fun. It can be fun. It is a practice, though. It's like art. It's something you have to do over and over again, and you learn new ways to do it, and there are many, many ways to do it. And some deliberation, like some art making, can be tedious, but it can be rewarding, and parts of it can be joyful and can be meaningful. Doing democracy can be a source of meaning and joy and belonging in the world. The next chapter talks about inclusion and exclusion. Who is included in the demos of democracy? Considering the question, who counts as part of the we? So Wendy Brown, in one passage, she quotes, says, "To have democracy, there has to be a we. You have to know who we the people are. It can't just be a kind of vague universal thing." But inclusion can also be a form of domination.
Predatory inclusion, right?
Yeah. Predatory inclusion is a phrase used in the Debt Collective Manifesto. So inclusion, exclusion as a tension within democracy. Who gets to be part of the democracy and who doesn't?
Another way of thinking about it is forced assimilation of the indigenous, where you're being shoved into a box and being forced to identify as something that you don't wish to identify. When she talks about the resistance of indigenous Native Americans, and especially like in places like Canada or in America, refusal to use U.S. passports, right, as a way of creating new lines of freedom.
There wasn't a whole lot in here that I recall about autonomy, but what about the right to not participate in a violent, destructive, colonialist, hetero-patriarchal capitalist system? I never consented to this. We didn't consent to being part of this extractive, exploitive system, but we are nonetheless included. There's no escaping it. We live in a society that has a certain design and shape. And so the questions about inclusion, exclusion, I think have to be thought of not only in the terms of what we might aim to create ideally as in a democracy, but what exists right now.
Yeah. And also birth. Like, for instance, I'm not happy being a white guy because I get all these privileges that then I get to abuse or ignore because the system gives me these immediate birth lottery rewards.
luck of birth.
You're a white male, heterosexual. I'm not really happy at being this identity where I'm constantly getting benefits for things that I don't think should exist.
You get all the privileges.
Yeah, that's something that could have been narrated in here. But I do think that the aspect of thinking about predatory inclusion was interesting, because I usually use the phrase assimilation, and we think of it both positive and negative forms of assimilation. So assimilation where you choose to assimilate versus a forced assimilation. And the use of inclusion is interesting because attaching predatory talks about how violent inclusion can be, that within the binary is another binary.
Yeah. A form of predatory inclusion is imposed on all of us by capitalism.
Yeah.
Capitalism is always including everybody, whether you want to be part of it or not.
And this is why sometimes, I do agree with parts of Murray Bookchin's claim about lifestyle anarchism and the problem of it, of not actually wanting to build institutional change and shape the world and just go into your little fetish lifestyle of being an anarchist listening to punk music. But it's very true that if you're an anarchist, there's very few places to actually live like an anarchist.
Yeah.
And so the interpersonal is one of these areas where you can actually live that way, because as anarchists, both of us identify within that moral framework, we're forced and compelled to do all kinds of predatory inclusive things.
Yeah.
Either we do it or it's being done to us.
This quote from the interview with Wendy Brown that also appears in the film about the question of who is included, that there has to be a we, and that it can't be just a vague universal thing. I think not only did Astra bristle at that, I also bristle at that notion. I think that contention here in the meditation is, okay, yes, within the bounds of competing nation states, the reality is we always have to deal with borders. But why not hold on strongly to a universal inclusion, not inclusion in some arbitrary or predatory or non-democratic system, but inclusion in utopia as a universal idea?
Absolutely. Why does there have to be an inside-outside at all? This is because of the scarcity logic of capitalism and nation-state borders carved by violence and bullets that we think that there has to be an inside-outside group. Why does there have to be? Because especially at the end of the book, she makes a claim towards a broader we is possible, and that to actually save the earth will require a universal we.
And what's important there, I think, is also a voluntary association, that if we can associate in this we voluntarily, and we have autonomy, then it becomes less a sort of conflicted kind of inclusion.
And when the circumscribed aspect of we versus them can actually be temporary about deliberation and participation. So, for instance, if you live outside of my house, have a right to tell me where I put my cups in my kitchen at? It's really a question of the people that live in the house and that are democratically using these materials, where there does have to be some limits to we. Because of democratic deliberation. And that in an anarchist sense, your rights to participation and democratic deliberation are about the ways in which it affects you and the way in which you participate within that circumscribed circle. And so there can be limits, but there are limits to deliberation.
The ideas here also can't be disconnected from the ideas that are taken up previously and afterward in the other sets of tensions, especially when it comes to scale and so forth. And I appreciate that she'd spend some time too meditating on the inclusion of non-human participants in the we, so animals and the environment or robots potentially. So I think this idea of who is a participant, beyond my assertion that we need to hold an ideal to strive for of abolishing borders altogether.
Much like democracy, we can have a transformational, ever-expansive, ever-inclusive we if it's voluntary and respects the right to existence and expression.
This, I think of a forest as a metaphor a lot, because if we think of ourselves as trees in a forest, and we can exist in harmony in that way as a valuable contributing part of a diverse ecosystem, then
mutual interdependence is one way to think about it, right?
Absolutely. The next part is on coercion and choice. This chapter talks about the tension between autonomous choice and constraining coercion. And she prefaces the meditation in this chapter by posing the question, when is coercion legitimate? And says that a democratic society demands that people engage in two simultaneous frameworks, deciding what can and should be done, and also what cannot or should not be done.
She could have asked a very different question, is why is coercion ever legitimate?
You're saying you could maybe frame it in a more radical kind of way.
Or is it ever legitimate?
ever.
That's the anarchist question, right? So,
I do think that in the way that she takes up the word coercion and applies the word coercion in this chapter, it is largely synonymous with persuasion.
mm-hmm.
To me, the paradox is that it takes massive amounts of coercion in this way for us to move towards democracy.
Mm-hmm.
That the progress of moving towards more democracy is always going to entail some coercion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where I think she's talking more about persuasion, because persuasion, there's not the threat of violence or punishment with persuasion. Coercion, there's always the threat of some type of violence or punishment, physical, mental, or otherwise. And I think that's the deciding line semantically to me. Is she going for coercion as persuasion, or is she going for coercion as something that includes persuasion as well?
There's presumably in coercion some sort of threat, whether it's the threat to withhold, as in strikes, or the threat of violence, as in lawfare. It also talks about in here civil disobedience, and Martin Luther King defining civil disobedience as a form of constructive, coercive power. It seems that democracy is so far away that for most of us, there's very little space in life outside of coercion, really, when you think about it. Most of the space that we even associate with choice, the other side of this, is actually just a severely truncated set of options with an imposed framework, not autonomous choice.
And so we have to look at non-market moments, and that goes back to that great, beautiful, elegant essay from David Graeber, Are You an Anarchist? The Answer Might Surprise You, where he says, like, look, we collaborate together, all these kinds. When we go to parks, we collaborate, and we don't need coercion. We can collaborate when the market is no longer present.
We live in a pyramid-shaped world where forms of coercion are the only means of broad social interaction that are possible. We have no choice but forms of coercion. And things that we perceive as choice in this consumer landscape are actually just consumer choice inside the bounds of consumer choice. Our choice is Pepsi or Coke. And is that really a choice? Is that really a choice?
It's kind of like what she calls the framework of architecture, the nudging that goes on with consumption. There's a lot of constant nudging. But I did love her discussion on contract theory. John Locke and others looking at the roles in which contract theory allows for some agreement to coercion so long as certain policies are met for people.
In my view, we need to be aiming for cooperative deliberation so that we can create social agreements based on consent. So if we consent to there being some limits, parameters that may involve coercion to stay within, as long as we are doing that through real democratic process, if we can arrive at those through full, participatory, cooperative deliberation, we don't need to resort to coercion. Ideally, in an anarchist, communist, utopian way, everything would be entirely arrived at through consensus and consent.
But I think she makes that nice pivot, because when we look at the role of the market, and James Buchanan, a student of Milton Friedman's idea of what's called public choice theory or constitutional economics, is a way in which choosing is being done as consumer nodes, and we're all these little bots, versus her great section on worker cooperatives on page 155 on, where she talks about if we're looking at how we have freedom or choice to do things, we don't have actual freedom or choice when work is the majority of our waking life is going to work, and it's constant violent coercion. So when she talks about the Chicago South Side and the Opportunity Threads business in Appalachia, she gives real examples of how folks experience collaboration, mutual integration, and solidarity in ways that they didn't have at their prior workplaces, and flips the script, I think, very cleverly, saying, okay, if you want to take over our democracy with your version of coercion, why don't we go into your shit, the markets, and make them democratic? It's a beautiful flip she does in the chapter. I thought it was really brilliant.
If we are able to actually practice democracy, we can actually make social arrangements based on consent through cooperative deliberation and full participation. The prohibition of harmful behaviors is not merely a matter of coercion or constraint, but of mutual agreement. So if we say, don't cause harm in these kinds of ways, it doesn't have to be a or else or a threat of punishment, a system of punishments. It can be an agreement, which is important, because if it's a mutual agreement, if a social arrangement that prohibits a kind of activity or behavior or harm, that creates a legitimate and actionable basis and foundation for restorative restorative and transformative justice.
Absolutely. And where we can actually erase the hierarchies of race and gender that is so ensnared with this dictatorship of the workplace. I think the thing she misses out, and I think should have mentioned this chapter, which is cleverly titled Choose This or Else with the exclamation point, is that the enhancement and scale of making every workplace a worker cooperative means we're going to start living democracy, but also demanding more from the political system because our workplace is better than our democracy. So it has this kind of virtuous circle that appears where it intensifies our demands, where we start to expect more from politicians and the political system.
Therein lies part of the paradox, again, that it is only presumably through coercion that we might arrive at a space where we can structure society such that worker-owned cooperatives are the primary mode of production.
The rejection of coercion towards collaboration.
Yes.
Maybe you could say this chapter could be called Coercion versus Collaboration. It's folks like this, folks of color, women, LGBT people, people that are disabled, people that are actively discriminated in the dictatorship of the workplace that start thinking about their right.
Yeah.
And the idea of human rights really comes from women in Athens that were denied the right, as well as slaves in Athens, the right to actually participate in sortition. And so this is where we get the clarity and the vision of someone's oppression, is that it provides the solution through its most absurd forms of violence.
The next chapter is on spontaneity and structure. And in this one...
This is also called Jesse and Matt.
Yeah. Guess who fulfills which role? In this one, she talks about how democracy involves a tension between spontaneous action and consistent structure. This is the chapter in which she talks about sortition at more length and offers the idea that sortition may in fact be a way to achieve harmony between this tension between spontaneity and structure. She writes that history shows us that there are no shortcuts. Spontaneous expressions of discontent have to be expanded and advanced by the hard, slow work of organizing with the aim of structural change.
Yeah, this is one where I felt like there could have been more work in this chapter, even though it's lovely like the rest of the book. I felt like it really could have focused on solutions to money in politics and exclusive public financing. She does a tremendous job educating me on sortition, which really gave me a great resource and information about, walking in Athens and seeing the moment where the crisis occurred for sortition to happen, and that it was about having the right person at the right time suggest some improvisational idea that was seemingly spontaneous, but created an entire new architecture for imagining us as human beings. And I love that section, although I do wish she did talk about, when she talks about the role of money in politics and the system of legalized bribery, that she actually talked about public financing of elections. I would have loved for her to talk about the Norwegian system, which is the best system and which is, I think, still currently the happiest place on earth. They have a very strong public financing system. So I would have loved to have seen that, not just sortition, although sortition, I think, should be the end goal.
As a project of meditation and reflection on the idea, I wouldn't count it against it at all that it strays from offering sort of
certain orders, exactly, strategy orders. I'm not suggesting that she should have said, here, let's do exclusive public financing so we have thousands of Bernie Sanders and then move to sortition. But
No,
I think
but certainly it gets right to the heart of the problem. And I think you're right, much in the way that I would connect getting money out of politics and sortition in a through line of potential phases. The goal, I think, would be, as we talked about in our last discussion, a broader wholesale adoption as a design feature of democracy, of sortition, of assignment to legislative bodies by random selection. Again, there are all kinds of things to think about and consider in designing such systems. And again, I would refer to the Real Utopias book, Legislature by Lot, by John Gaskell and Eric Olin Wright, as one place to consider some design choices in that regard.
Yeah, and the book Against Elections as well.
In Astra's book, she does mention and draw upon David Van Raybrook's book Against Elections, but that much like I would put UBI, universal basic income or guaranteed basic income, forward as a necessary, urgent, and transformational intervention into our current systems as a leverage point out of them, as a way to get towards abolishing the cost of living and away from the stranglehold of the systems of economics and finance, not as the end goal itself. Likewise, I would put getting money out of politics and public financing of elections is a transitional point towards fighting towards a future where we rely more on sortition.
One of my theory about this is if we have thousands of Bernie Sanders, and there's something unique about Vermont that allowed him to be elected, is that when politicians start giving us stuff, we're going to start participating in it because we're being heard. And the reason why people are detached from electoral politics and electioneering is precisely because we're being gaslit all the time by people that operate for cyberpunk interests of banks and corporations. And so exclusive public financing allows for the through line towards fractal sortition, which I think we'll talk about in another episode.
Well, we need thousands of Cory Bushes and Jamal Bowmans, not just Bernie Sanders.
Or AOC, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We need people who've lived real lives experiencing the bottom end of the pyramid scheme.
Of capitalism.
Yeah. So super excited to see the discussion about sortition, the drawing of lots.
Yes. So definitely not that I needed to know about public financing, but I was so grateful that there was a strong section on sortition.
She offers that selection by lot may not be the perfect solution to the problems we face, but it suggests that other radically different ways of structuring political participation and incorporating spontaneity are possible.
Yeah.
That it's a way to balance this paradox.
Yeah.
Listen to Astra. She's an artist. Listen to artists. Artists know about balancing spontaneity and structure.
Yes.
It is often a core part of any artist's practice to devise some sort of constraints, some sort of structure, so that you have a play space for spontaneity.
Oh, I mean, as a writer, it's the same thing. You have a rough draft, you have a different revised draft, which is about the interplay of spontaneity and structure.
Yeah.
And when you're making music or doing a painting or designing something, whether it's architecture or landscape or concepts, there is that play between.
It's responding to constraints. Mm-hmm. That is what is so rewarding, is finding a solution within constraints. Mm-hmm. The constraints of structure make creative spontaneity possible. Mm-hmm. This is in contrast to the narrative and the tyranny of bad ideas that we live under, that in this pyramid-shaped world of compounding hierarchies, it overemphasizes structure as the only thing that matters. No creativity, only this hierarchical structure.
When we're talking about creativity, think about how UBI offers structure in people's lives. Right. To do the spontaneous flowering of creativity.
Yes.
So UBI is a structure for organizing society that creates a mass level of civic engagement, grassroots organizers. Grassroots organizers will never exist in a mainstream sense in civic life without UBI.
We say UBI as a transitional leverage point towards building a world where we guarantee the golden square.
Yeah.
UBI would create a sort of small structure for us to then springboard off of to create the real baseline that we should be fighting for of fully decommodified food, shelter, healthcare, and education.
It's both a structure and a subsidy. So it's a subsidy that allows for further structure and gives us the spontaneity to imagine other alternatives.
Yeah.
When you're worried about surviving and you don't think you have rights to exist, UBI tells you have a right to exist.
The next chapter is on the tension between expertise and mass opinion.
Cleverly titled A Socratic Mob.
The Socratic
and
mob.
This is a reference to Madison's quote that even if you had Socrates in the agora of Athens or Titian, you would still have bedlam and madness. And of course, that was very good for him because he was interested in protecting property and the wealthy.
Right. In this chapter, it talks about how we live in a world run by technocrats, that it's justified according to an illusion of meritocracy, that we live in a reality where, whether we consented to or not, we leave the decision-making to the experts, so-called experts, because we are told we should fear the idiocy of the masses, fear the mob. Mm-hmm. She writes that democracy demands that everyone contemplate and deliberate, that all of us think and reason, even if there have always been some who would prefer that we didn't.
Definitely. I mean, and she talks about the dangers. I mean, Obama is the wet dream of ordo liberals. And we typically think of Obama as this shrine to liberals who obsess about his decorum and his manners and his symbolic grace. But they ignore the fact that Obama is pretty much the apotheosis of neoliberalism. He's the entirely competent, smooth operator for a technocracy where everything's arranged by market logic. And this is the danger of having those kinds of people in power. power, is they don't know what the fuck is going on. And there's incompetence that's hidden underneath this glaze or gaze of a technocracy. She gets at that with this false notion of meritocracy. I was deeply fascinated and thought it was funny that the idea of meritocracy was rooted in a social satire by a labor parliamentarian who ends up seeing his satire come to life.
Yeah. Well, isn't that how many ideas come to wider usage?
They come to mean the very opposite thing they should be. So River Combahee Collective's idea of identity politics is now the exact opposite of what it was supposed to be, much like meritocracy is supposed to be a critique of something that should never happen.
When we think about how we might design for a balance of highly specialized areas of knowledge and general all-purpose deliberative and cooperative decision-making in a democracy, again, I would advocate for sortition to be used as a primary methodology for assignment to legislative bodies, and that those legislative bodies would take up the questions of what do we need and what do we want in society, but that the specialized expertise in technology, in science, and so forth, that we would need to actually build and construct and design things that would be solutions, and the technologies that we would need to arrive at those things we want and need could be done through elections to elect delegates or representatives from areas of specialized knowledge and expertise. I think what's also really important in this discussion is education.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We got to talk about that. This is where expertise and mass opinion meet, is the educational zone of human development, and how the commodification and privatization of education makes education transactional and fear-based.
Yeah.
It's within a scarcity logic. And so you can't actually do the things that you want to do, like the student dressed up as a dolphin passing out flyers to stop plastic bags, talking about how students are fearful of being political or saying political things because they don't want it to hurt their resume. And I had a student like this at UCR that didn't want to have their name attached to anything with the group because they're in computer science and they didn't want to look like they were too political, even though they were Bernie Sanders supporters.
Their potential future employer is going to think that they're a commie.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of the censorship, the self-censorship of this, is this privatization of fear through scarcity logic of markets, and that education's now doing the exact opposite. It's making students know less and less about what they should know more and more about.
Yeah.
And Wendy Brown talks about how when she was in college that it was a place where you could experiment and become another human being.
This discussion on this paradox centers the decommodification of education as an urgent need and connects to both the idea that we talk about of the golden square and also the debt collectives work on the student debt strike and the urgent work right now to try to get the next U.S. administration to cancel all the U.S. federal student debt, which can be done with just one signature, and also to win and create free college and university systems, that is a necessary, urgent fight in this regard.
And if the left wants to rebuild, it has to reattach itself to a reformation of fighting for the workplace and fighting for the school place.
Yes.
And this is what the neoliberal project has done to destroy our opinion, to become experts ourselves and to own the dominion of our psyche, is that education has been dismantled and privatized. Labor and workplace trade unionism has been destroyed. And that's what we see very clearly with the story of Brett, is that he talks about how it wasn't until they took the library away that they were able to actually do hunger strikes. That this was the last straw. And the connection she makes is very beautiful between these points. It's both in the documentary and in the film. And that relationship between this black man who's a poet and a barber versus these kids who are getting the food that he was making while in prison, these meat patties. And the most beautiful moment in the book, much like in the film, comes from this black girl in this school system that's been privatized and relentlessly gouged from lack of tax funding. She says, school is supposed to be your home away from home, where you're just getting an education. But I feel like if you're just taking away stuff from us, that's not right. My mom won't take away my lunch and say, oh, no, you can't eat. No, she won't do that. She's going to find a way for me to have a better environment. I feel like when we take away stuff from us, it's just like, why? Why are you doing this? What's the point of taking away vending machines from children? Some kids don't even eat breakfast. So when 7:15 hits and they haven't eaten breakfast and you say, we're not serving breakfast, That's a whole day that they're not even thinking about school. They're thinking, I'm hungry, I'm starving, I'm not having a better environment. So I feel like, why do you take it away? Why not try to make it better? If you hear us just say something about it, you should say, that's a concern. We'll put it on the board for our next meeting. Don't just try to push it under the rug and say, no, you're not going to do this and try to beat us. I don't understand it. Much like the women of Athens who decided that they had rights at the very point when they were facing the abyss, this black girl, much like this barber, have to be taken away from all forms of dignity before a visionary compass is reformed. And that's what we see in this moment, this like heat-seeking moment of perception, which is the best moment of the movie and also the most moving passage of the book.
This reflection on this paradox also reminds us of what the horizon ought to be.
Yes.
And a formulation of how to get to that horizon, and recalls for me the socialist principle, sometimes referred to as a communist principle, from each according to ability to each according to need. What we need is an ecology, a diverse ecology of mutually beneficial arrangements, that we should value all forms of labor. And it is great to see folks like Cori Bush being the first
homeless
people
mother, nurse, now politician.
Yeah, actually closer to the centers of power, because having experience at all these levels of a diverse set of types of labor, like I have in my life of cleaning toilets and being a creative director, right? So all of those things.
That was the failure of the Leninist project, was that Lenin didn't clean toilets. If he was occupying places of marginality while being in power, maybe you would have had a different Soviet system. And Cori Bush, I think, is important because from a great darkness comes a greater light. And she's an example of that, as someone who's formerly homeless, a nurse, someone who was a medic for Black Lives Matter. And that comes to the quote of Diana Presley. She has a great quote that says, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. So this little girl in the school system, we should be talking to her.
She needs power.
She should be on a
the power.
She should be having the mic to reorganize her entire fucking school system, because she knows it better than anybody.
Well, the people with the mic need to pass it to her.
Yes, exactly. The mic needs to be given to her. Exactly. And that's the solution. And she says, put it on the board and talk about it. Take my input. No, actually, don't put it on the board. Let her speak. Right. And I think that's crucial. And you get this idea of the reemergence of when things get really bad, that education becomes this potential form of utopian horizon, like the idea of the cigar factory where people be read to that couldn't read. The fact that communism grew in Italy through reading groups by workers, that after work they would read Das Kapital. Not Communist Manifesto, they'd read Das Kapital, right? Barely literate.
The hope would be that we would emerge from these past 5 decades and this onslaught of neoliberalism to reimagine ourselves in a new era of truth, reckoning, reparations, and transformation, but also one of a renewed investment in education.
Absolutely.
And a renewed investment in valuing all forms of labor.
As Howard Zinn said, education can and should be dangerous.
Yes. The next chapter takes up the paradox of the local versus the global. In this chapter, she writes that democracy means rule of the people, but where do they rule? Where do they exercise democracy? And how many people can this space hold? So this is about the scale problem. She writes that self-rule is generally a place-based phenomenon, an action tied to a particular location and the people who inhabit it. At what size are territories and groups best suited for collective decision-making? And at what point does direct deliberation become impossible? She writes also that it's a paradox. While the democratic imagination is open and expansive, the practice has to be both bounded and grounded, embodied in particular populations and places. Only by taking root can democratic seeds spread. I think through our conversation, this comes up a lot, even when we're not directly talking about democracy per se. This balance of local and global and the tensions therein is a topic that we touch upon a lot.
Yeah, especially when you talk about creating social change.
Yes.
Is the horizon some obsession with presidential politics and electoral politics or national politics, following, like Reese's Pieces, these aliens called politicians? Or do we go back and totally take control of our local communities, creating prefigurative politics, where prefigurative politics is more possible on the local level than it is on the national level?
Not to criticize the project for exclusion of anything in particular, but I think it would have been perhaps illuminating to have incorporated some of the ideas of Murray Bookchin here, especially about communalism, because it takes up this problem of scale, this relationship of the local to the global.
Popular assemblies, popular assemblies.
Well, Bookchin's writings on social ecology and communalism through a set of federated relationships is an approach to tackle this problem of scale.
Or Rojava. She could have focused on Rojava in general, which is Murray Bookchin's project taken to 2.0 scale with Öcalan's ideas about what's called democratic confederalism, where you could actually see how the local becomes a solution. And this is something Graeber talked about with Rojava, which I do think should have been talked about in this book, but is that Rojava is not just a local phenomenon of direct democracy, it's also a regional solution to the problems of Palestine and Israel. It's also a solution to the problems in Iran and ethnic tribalism, because they have developed a toolkit that allows for the expansion of all kinds of marginalized voices, where 51% of women make up every committee, and that ethnic communities that are not religious are put into a umbrella of a tapestry of voices. And I think that's crucial in there. So definitely those are important, because we can imagine how these locals scale up using the politics of democratic confederalism.
We can imagine, but unfortunately, it's oft left in the space of imagination, because there are sadly too few examples of
libertarian socialism,
real serious attempts to engage in democratic arrangements designed to connect the local to the global. One of the things she says in this chapter that draw attention to this paradox, she writes, financial markets, neoliberal trade regimes, and Fortune 500 companies are all transnational, but democracy remains bound to the nation state. There's the problem, right? The nation state. The nation state is part of the problem. It's not the whole problem.
It blocks scalability. It blocks scalability, right? It's a conceptual prison on the minds of a universal we.
Connecting back to the previous paradoxes and how we would hold other parts of them as ideals, we would hold consensus as ideal, hold universal inclusion as an ideal, we would hold global as ideal, hold transnational or meta-national, post-national as an ideal, that the ideal should be no more fucking nation states.
Absolutely.
What I would offer as a perspective in this regard is that as folks of anarchist ethics, we're not disengaged from the realm of electoral politics. We have to engage within the constraints that we are presented with here and now, but that we hold a horizon line that is emancipatory, radically egalitarian horizon line.
Utopian horizon.
That utopian horizon is one where we do not have the violent,
we do not cede ground to the nation state as the end goal, right? And so this is what I often tell students, like, I'm a social anarchist, but I'm also a strategic statist. States come in different size cages. So if you're in Denmark or Ethiopia or Botswana or Nigeria or Canada, those states all are different size cages. And we can make those cages so large that we can put our arms out and unlock the door. Where our arms can come through that cage and unlock ourselves. And that's what we should think about in our negotiation with the state, is be strategic and mindful. And you see this with Rojava. They're very aware of these outside powers and are massively clever and diplomatic with dealing with these other nation states. They actually, as David Graeber talks about, they create this parallel state system that's largely symbolic so they can deal with these other state actors while they still have real decisions being made in a direct democracy. And I think that's important to remember, is that we should never, ever give up on a sense of international socialism in a borderless world.
Some nation-state cages, as you put it, are more constricting than others and put more constriction on our day-to-day imagination and awareness of the rest of the world. In the US and in Canada, it can be very hard to feel an attachment to an international solidarity. But this is super, super important, a perspective and a fight that it engages in struggle in an international way and in building international solidarity.
On that international solidarity feeds into a sense of, you know what? We don't have to have this type of cruelty in America or Canada. And also a sense of like, oh, this country does something much better than us. They're less cruel. They're more compassionate. Man, I want this to happen in this shitty cage I'm living in.
Let's take the best ideas from everywhere. That's the Michael Moore thing, right?
Where to Invade Next. Where to Invade Next. His best documentary.
Yeah, which also had some touching scenes with school children that were
very moving,
noteworthy.
right?
Yeah, moving and noteworthy from that film. But I think also mirroring this paradox is the need for an international solidarity, but also local autonomy.
Exactly.
So another way to frame it would be between international solidarity and local autonomy.
And she mentions, which I think is cool, she mentions Cooperation Jackson here in Jackson, Mississippi, how you can ignore certain laws and policies of the state by doing prefigurative politics on the local. And if you read the great introduction to the book Jackson Rising, it actually has this 40-page introduction. It says, why don't you become, with blanks underneath, the next Cooperation Jackson? And your city's name is blank.
Yeah.
It's saying that we want to be the template for something that's more emancipatory than just getting our shit, which is what a right libertarian wants, is I got my shit, fuck you. This is about international solidarity.
The other thing here echoed in the quotes from Wendy Brown is the perceived intractability of the problem of scale.
Mm-hmm.
I think even though it's reflected upon as this sort of impossible task to think of a truly global democratic arrangements, I don't think it's impossible.
No.
And maybe that's me just being an anarchist idealist again, but I do think that there are real practical ways looking at the design systems in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about this just briefly in the last conversation about an idea I put forward about using a fractal relationship, a self-similar relationship based on Dunbar's number, a ratio of 1 to 150, as a way to build a nesting system of sortition that would allow for full participation of every person, all 7.8 billion people on the planet.
And look what these multinationals already do. With dizzying speed, they transfer capital from one place to the other.
Yeah.
The logistics of Amazon suggests that we could have a logistics of democracy.
Yes.
Right? And that with using
Absolutely.
technology for open source platforms, we can crowdsource and deliberate over decisions with the kind of rapidity that technology could allow.
If we can just stop acting in a violent, contradictory way towards each other and towards the operations of this fragile planet, if we can leave the carbon in the ground, use the abundant energy radiating from the sun,
the anarchy of sunlight,
if we can act like the forest, we can do these things. We can totally have a global system of participatory governance that relates full participation of local autonomous regions to a global conception of we.
And if we look at one object we've talked about, it always comes up, but by following the moral compass of a tree, that it has a sovereignty to itself, but it's mutually involved and enveloped in the environment around it. It's a mutual system of interdependence. And so we should look at the tree for our economy, our relationships to each other, and our relationships to the non-human.
The next chapter is the tension between the present and the future. And she asks, what is the relationship of democracy to time? This is the chapter where she spends a good deal of time talking about climate catastrophe and climate change, and says that climate change is the greatest problem requiring collective action that humanity has ever faced. She also writes that true sustainability is anathema to capitalism.
It rests on that following precept that there must be more value at the end of the day than there was at the beginning. Capitalism just thrives on that speed and novelty and consumption, and we have to reverse that notion of growth.
This deals with not only with present and future, but also the past, because this is a continual problem of all nation states, and the U.S. is embarrassingly and tragically attached to the past. There is far more weight given to the vote of long-dead slave owners than there are to each of us in the American system, and its obsession with adherence to a 200-plus-year-old constitution.
We're being drowned by the past, essentially, right? I mean, we're burdened by the past. And this idea of the democracy of the dead is something that Edmund Burke talks about, but is actually recanted at some point because it holds us against any possibility or framework of imagining the new. And that's why she cleverly talks about Thomas Paine and his rebuke to that notion, because fundamentally the living have a responsibility to imagine the future. They're the only ones that are actually shaping the world as it exists. They have the right to reshape it and change it as they wish to do so.
We should not continually adhere to the bad ideas of dead slave owners.
Absolutely.
A basic premise of any democratic system, I would say, ought to be the ability, the right, the necessity of continually remaking social arrangement and social agreements. Like science should always just be considered a hypothesis. This arrangement that we may have agreed upon at one point in time is a hypothesis about how best to arrange our society. And that hypothesis should always be up for interrogation. So the constitutions, such as they may exist, should always be malleable. If they are not malleable, there's something tragically
wrong
amiss.
Yeah, I mean, and the great quote she offers in the book, too, from Karl Marx, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under the circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generation weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living.
It is a fucking nightmare.
Absolutely.
Fucking slave owners.
Zombie slave owners and their shitty ideas about patriarchy.
Also taking up the urgency of climate collapse. Climate collapse is, I would say, the final bell for humanity.
It's experiment to discover itself in a rightful way.
This is like last chance, motherfuckers. You either choose democracy or you die.
Yeah.
Either work together or you're going to go extinct. It brings into clear focus the choice that we have. It is eco-socialism or extinction. In the words of Buckminster Fuller, it is utopia or oblivion. The only reason we aren't looking out for the future of humanity and the condition of the planet is because we are locked into a myopic thrall with horribly bad ideas.
It's fucking poison pyramid-shaped scheme.
Yep, poison pyramid, this fucking pyramid-shaped world. The urgent, obvious truth is that capitalism cannot continue. It must not continue. It is a fucking cult. It is a fucking death cult. And if it continues, we will fucking die.
Wow. When you say that, I want to put myself in a baby blanket and cry.
Just the urgency.
Yeah,
I think we have to approach this with that kind of do or die recognition. It might be scary, but we have to fucking acknowledge it as such because that's the reality.
Because we talked about this in the prior podcast too, on library socialism and the Golden Square, that we could have this circulating abundance with better designed systems instead of this privatized hoarding that's shoving things into closets as the earth collapses. Just so I can have more stuff to put in my house, right? Yeah. So definitely.
I've long been overtly anti-capitalist, but
now we're out of time.
We're out of time. The clock is ticking, and I just have no patience for anything that isn't overtly anti-capitalist. I don't think there's any other ethical position available given our current reality. The 60s have gone on for 50 years now, and we need to fucking get rid of bad ideas. Capitalism is up at the top of the list of the worst of them.
Absolutely.
Those are the 8 chapters, the 8 meditations. There are certainly many readers would think of additional paradoxes. Astra herself mentions a couple of them in the conclusion. She talks about optimism and pessimism as an additional paradox. But one that I wanted to touch on just briefly is abundance versus scarcity.
Yes.
Abundance and scarcity as a tension that's held always. And the issue is that on a finite planet with real material limits, we must continually balance our productive capacity with real material constraints.
Because Spaceship Earth's going to implode from the inside, right? It's just not going to be able to keep its passengers on board.
In this pyramid-shaped world, based on ever-present compounding hierarchies, what is imposed on all of us is a false logic of scarcity. And this false logic of scarcity is imposed in every fucking sphere of our life. Every area of your life, you're supposed to think of as this competition for scarce resources. Shared abundance is at odds with this underlying philosophy that produces privatized hoarding. The underlying philosophy of a world designed according to compounding hierarchies is in stark contrast to the notion of shared prosperity.
I think this is where the thread could have been put into, because underneath all of the right-wing logic and the rise of neo-fascism in fascism in general that she talks about with this right-wing framework of equality versus freedom is this idea of a lack.
Yes.
And underneath the right-wing framework is this idea that there's not enough.
Yes.
And that there can never be enough.
Right.
And that never enough means also that there won't be enough,
Right.
And so it actually will live its values by having actual scarcity because of these real material biosphere limits. And underneath all of that is this idea that democracy creates a post-scarcity horizon, and that the right's attack on the left is based on the mythology that there's not enough for all of us.
Right. This gets to one of the mind-melting, paralyzing contradictions of capitalism, is that on the one hand, there's never enough. There's never enough money for education or for healthcare or for anything that's for the public good, anything that would allow us to have real freedom. There's never enough. But on the other hand, everything always has to grow, perpetual growth. Like she writes in the book, at the end of every day, we have to have more value than we started with. How the fuck do those things balance out? That equation is just impossible to balance. It is such a paralyzing and mind-melding contradiction that illustrates that capitalism is fucking idiotic. This is just fucking stupid. That is an equation that doesn't work. Perpetual growth and there's never enough. Those are in absolute contradiction. And it just illustrates how fucking idiotic capitalism is.
It cheapens our consciousness as human beings.
Yeah.
It puts us in this shitty default setting of expecting less and doing less and really embracing a kind of nihilism that we don't need.
The other part of this paradox or this tension between abundance and scarcity relates to the question of who gets to participate and how much space do you get to take up. And I think trace back to why sortition is an important design feature to incorporate into systems of democracy, because there's also this logic of scarcity is applied to who gets to have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
It's the idea that there's only limited number of seats at the table. And then for how long do people occupy those seats?
One way to think of it as a general crude vulgarization of this idea is that a degree at which we deliberate and participate in the democratic method is based on the level at which us or the people we love are affected by it. So when you look at the Keystone Pipeline, like, what the fuck is that? Because the people that are being the most affected by it have the least say in whether the pipeline was going to go in there. That's when you're living in a fascist dictatorship, is when the people that are going to be dramatically affected by water, sacred rights to burial grounds, all of that stuff, they're completely blocked out because the market knows best.
I think it's important to talk about this tension between abundance and scarcity and the scarcity logic that is imposed on us, because it also gets to the problems of celebrity and aristocracy, having a small number of elites in control of decision-making and of the mic. So beyond just technocrats, there's a long-held hierarchical notions that only a certain select few get to participate. But a truly democratic assertion would be that we can all participate. We must all participate.
Yes. Hit me.
Us all participating, the initial knee-jerk thing from this imposed scarcity logic would be, but we're going to be in endless meetings, right? The sort of red scare, fear of socialism, fear of real democracy is that, well, it's just going to be endless meetings. But it doesn't have to mean endless meetings.
And Graeber made a joke about it, that there's a difference between an academic meeting and a meeting of equals and Occupy, right? Or a meeting of a committee at DSA. They feel very different. When I go to an academic meeting, it's all based on hierarchy. It's all based on shut up. And when you have a meeting that is where, that's exactly what academia does. Shut up. The place that supports the discourse and free speech has the least amount of it in their meetings, right? That's why we need a no bullshit university podcast episode, right? To imagine that. But when we are among equals, and when the politics of listening are grounded by a sense of anarchist ethics, then they can be fun.
Any opposition to democracy and a deference to hierarchy rests on a scarcity logic. This is what undergirds the whole premise of a logic that would see democracy as incompatible with human relations, is because a scarcity logic and mythology is about hierarchy. We need to overcome the scarcity logic. We need to kill the boss in our heads.
No gods, no masters.
No gods, no masters. This is why I also connect in this balance of abundance and scarcity to library socialism, the idea from
Seriously Wrong podcast.
Sean and Aaron with the Seriously Wrong podcast, that we can create more with less. It's just about sharing. It's just about better institutional design so that we can share in a way that the forest shares. The forest gives back to the planet, helps the planet breathe.
And we can defeat the mass epidemic of loneliness through through this constant interaction of sharing material resources, whether it's a Switch or a DVD or a book, that when we have these sharing libraries that are meant for the people, we're going to be less lonely.
So the film wraps up with the last words given to Cornel West and Sylvia Federici, respectively. And Cornel West offers some wisdom connecting ideas from Plato to Dostoevsky to James Baldwin, and Plato's challenge that most people fear freedom and most people rather follow authority. How many people really want to be free? James Baldwin, as he says very few, that the burden is too much. Just tell me what to do. Highlighting this tension that one view of the history of humanity is that it is a history that is defined by hierarchy, domination, and oppression.
Part of that is that democracy is always an over / against phenomenon. It's always a reaction to a reaction. But there's another thing, which is the anti-democratic forms are the reaction to a society and human core that is bound by freedom. So if we look before mass civilization, there was no word for democracy. Murray Bookchin talks about that in Ecology of Freedom. The word democracy didn't exist. And the word freedom really translates to return to the mother's breast. And so we do have a rootedness towards democracy that doesn't have to be about hierarchy and domination or oppression. It's not always an over against phenomenon. It is in this case with the existing capitalist hellscape. And, Cornel West says, count me in the crowd of the holy fools, because he does believe that most people do want freedom and people do want to be free. But the context and the organizations have to be right.
Sylvia Federici, in the final scenes of the film, reflects on how women have always been excluded from democracy.
That's when they're looking at that painting, right?
Looking at the painting, the allegory on good and bad government in Siena in Italy, reflecting that the women's movement, showing us that the personal is political, that the sphere of social reproduction is a political sphere, and that democracy is worth fighting for. But we have to be sure about how we define it. Not from above, always from below.
And as a conversation in the podcast episodes with The Dig, Astra Taylor talks about the fact that she wanted to end with a conversation. So it ends with her talking to Sylvia Federici. I mean, as a conversation.
I say to those final points, here. Count me in the crowd of holy fools.
Hell yeah!
Fighting for democracy from below.
You are free, tree!
She wraps up the meditations in the book, advancing the idea that we should, instead of aiming to be founding fathers, let us aspire to be perennial midwives, helping always to deliver democracy anew.
Beautiful. It's a great ending. I mean, it also speaks, I think, again, to this constant growing, constant dynamism that I think the best utopian novels like Ursula K. Le Guin or Marge Piercy speak to, which is that utopia is a dynamic, ever-changing process, and that we should be constantly operating as midwives to the future.
As a reflection on that question, what is democracy? I would offer that democracy is when anarchy and design harmonize. That democracy can only happen when a just ethics of reciprocity and responsibility meet cooperation in public decision-making.
Hell yeah.
Anarchy, I like to say, is the North Star of human decency. Not necessarily a political program, but a ethics about social responsibility, an ethical toolkit for living together. That democracy is when that North Star of human decency meets a rational, evidence-based decision-making, aka design, about how our world is shaped. We don't need philosopher kings. We need anarchist comrades. We need anarchist designers. We need fellow designers with anarchist ethics.
And that gets to our notion of decommodify life and democratize society, that this is a two-part formula of how we arrange as anarchists in the mode of cooperation and collaboration to decommodify life and abolish the motherfucking cost of living. And demand that golden square as the social contract that we should be aiming towards. And it's the social contract both to each other and to different states, that we have food, shelter, healthcare, and education.
These things are both a goal and a process. Democracy is both a noun and a verb. There can be no real democracy with capitalism. We must choose socialism. And sortition needs to be part of our toolkit.
Absolutely.
Yes, I am deeply and profoundly troubled by the lack of democracy in our society, not only for all the myriad reasons contemplated in the book, in the film, but also because of the recognition that works like these exist as rare gems in our society.
Totally.
So hard to find.
The compassion, the elegance, the clarity of thought, the organizational gifts of both of these.
But my assertion is that they should not be rare.
Yeah.
This should not be the exception within the cultural landscape. These are fantastic works, and that we don't have more fantastic, generous, wise, creative works like this in society is just a real travesty.
It's a sign of the hellscape that we live in, because this kind of grace should be found as commonly as we see sunlight or water.
Yeah.
And we can imagine a society with UBI, with the Golden Square, where we have tons of ideas built off the ideas of this book and this documentary.
That's the conundrum here, right? Is that if we actually lived in a democracy, if we actually had a democratic society, meaning that if we lived in a socialist or communist world, that there would be thousands of works.
And in fact, this podcast would have had 3 books, not one, to talk about, that were all doing the same vital work, right?
Yeah.
So the scarcity of the quality of this as an experience tells us what a dystopian hellscape that we live in.
Capitalism means that all of this great human potential is held back. Capitalism is a gate preventing the expansion of human potential. We're just missing out on so much wisdom, so much creativity, and so much innovation from our fellow
human beings, right?
Human beings, from our neighbors. It's just reprehensible, and it's tragic, and it's heartbreaking. There are wonderfully talented, wise, and compassionate people everywhere, but most of them never get a chance. Most of them never have the opportunity to cultivate their potential. Most of them are just never seen. Most of them are invisible for their lives.
This is kind of like this great line from Kim Gordon where she said, the reason why we love watching artists perform music on stage is we see someone believe in themselves. And I think that's a paradox you feel when you go into a gallery, Jesse, when you see really great artists doing really great things. You feel less alone, but you also feel angry that there's so few people that have the chance to do this.
Yes.
To live a life of full capacity. Yeah. It's kind of a double entendre. It's like, yes, this is amazing. I feel connected. I feel less alone. I remember we went out of the experience with an artist watching a show and you said, I feel less lonely. But at the same time, a kind of rage builds that, why is this such a rare experience?
Exactly.
Why is the castle so small?
Yeah.
Why is there a castle?
Exactly. If future generations are going to experience freedom, it will largely be because folks like Astra Taylor, who were fortunate enough to have circumstances in their life where they were able to experience a degree of freedom, that with that freedom, that marginal degree of freedom, they advanced the fight for full emancipation. They used the microphone to say, give the microphone to others. That is why we need the Golden Square. Why we need to fully decommodify food, shelter, healthcare, and education for everyone.
This is the bedrock. The Golden Square is the bedrock for any real thriving of human society. That we can't actually start the train without this in the engine. Yeah. We encourage you to read the book. Yeah, I mean, it's a great book.
Absolutely. It is incredible work. Watch the film, read the book. They are pleasurable experiences. Both the film and the book are masterfully done. They are masterful works of curated wisdom, and they are things I think that you can return to again and again. Yeah. I agree that democracy does not exist, and it never has. It is certainly something that I've never experienced in my life. Seen glimpses of it, right?
Ephemeral.
Yeah, ephemeral glimpses of it, again, like in that baseline communism kind of way, mostly, but also in endeavors as an activist and as an artist and as a designer. But I nonetheless remain convinced that it's entirely within human capacity to achieve. Democracy hasn't existed, but we can do it. And maybe I think that just for no other reason than my own confidence in my latent capacity for democratic practice and my trust that others have that capacity too.
Well, and that the framework of these mythos, these myths that are stuck in our head don't have to be there. Like the great quote from Ursula K. Le Guin's last major speech at the National Book Awards, that we just assumed there was always the divine right of kings.
Yeah.
But that's no longer even assumed or expected or even acknowledged as a real idea, that we can level out as we move out and we can expand as we break out. And I think that's what this book accomplishes. And I do agree. This book makes me feel less alone.
I deeply yearn for engagement in what Astra calls better philosophical dilemmas.
Yes. And how boring it is, like she said, to have a conversation about billionaires not having money or even existing as billionaires,
Yeah.
that we shouldn't have 6 people own half the wealth of the United States.
Democracy may be a noble idea that is perpetually out of reach, but it remains out of reach only because bad ideas remain in the way.
And the ideas of sortition in the book and the ideas of worker cooperatives are like beautiful flowers that offer a prefigurative alternative.
Yeah.
And the bad ideas truly become bad and dumb and stupid and childish when you have this other alternative frame or vision through the window.
Better ideas are all over the fucking place.
As an activist friend once told me, we already have all the good ideas to implement. We just have to create the popular will.
Yeah.
When she quotes Gramsci, it's like the idea of the pessimism of the intellect, but the optimism of the will. Well, we don't have to have pessimism of the intellect because we actually have good ideas right now.
One of the reasons I think clearly that tyrants at the top of the pyramid hoarding all the power are so antagonistic to democracy in any way is that democracy, like science, is a process that if we actually do it, it'll help us get rid of bad ideas. If we can actually engage in democracy, we're like, why the fuck do we want this pyramid shaped?
These billionaires are frightened because they become redundant. They know they're worthless. They know they actually shouldn't exist. Their wealth is almost like our own sense of mortality. They know in the background that it's there, but they don't want to acknowledge it.
We can balance the tensions of democracy that Astra so skillfully illuminates through this work. We can overcome the paradoxes of democracy that Wendy Brown and Cornel West very eloquently and poetically retrace, but only if we actually practice democracy. Because I think the real paradox is that we cannot overcome the paradoxes of democracy except through the practice of democracy.
Absolutely. It's through the action and deliberation. Much like Clisthenes coming up with the idea of sortition, it was a spontaneous thing that appeared of creating geography as an identity, space, and blocks as a neighborhood. And let's do this in our own communities.
Yes, let's. I appreciate the patience, the deliberation, and the care in this conversation.
Thank you so much for the deliberation and care you gave to me.
Read the book.
Cheers.
Cheers.